Good evening, everybody. I'm Helen Brodie, President of the Queensland Library Foundation, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here this evening to a Portrait of an Artist event with Sebastian Di Mauro. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and pay respects to their ancestors who came before them. The location of State Library on Kurilpa Point was historically a significant meeting, gathering and sharing place for Aboriginal people. We proudly continue that tradition here today. I would also like to acknowledge Mr. James C Sourris AM and his sister, Miss Marika Sourris, generous donors of the Portrait of an Artist program and its related James C Sourris AM collection of artist interviews developed and held by State Library. Unfortunately, James and Marika are unable to be with us this evening, but it's thanks to their commitment to arts in Queensland that we can celebrate the work of Sebastian Di Mauro. Sebastian and his partner Dennis, thank you Sebastian for being part of this fabulous program. Louise Martin-Chew, arts writer extraordinaire. Louise has lent her skills to many digital interviews in the James C Sourris AM collection and will be interviewing Sebastian tonight. Chris Saines, Director of Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art, and Dr. Sandra Phillips, Library Board of Queensland. Tonight is the first of 3 events this year in our 2019 Portrait of an Artist series. The Portrait of an Artist series was conceived in 2016 as a means to bring to life the James C Sourris AM collection of artist interviews, part of the Australian Library of Art here at State Library. These fascinating interviews tell the stories of some of our country's finest and most respected contemporary artists and reveal a great breadth and diversity of practice and experience. Filmed in their studios and workrooms, the interviews allow the artists to describe their lives in their own words, sometimes sharing deeply personal reflections on the influences that have shaped their lives and work. The artist interviews provide a valuable resource for current and future generations, and we are immensely grateful for the incredible generosity of our donors who support us in delivering this important work. For those of you interested in the work of State Library, the Queensland Library Foundation invites you to consider becoming a supporter and helping State Library to bridge the gap and deliver services and programs where they're most needed. Tonight, we have the pleasure of hearing about the life and work of Innisfail-born artist Sebastian Di Mauro. Sebastian now lives and works in Wilmington, Delaware, and was an associate professor at Griffith University until he retired in 2016. Born to an Italian-Australian family, Sebastian's art practice encompasses sculpture, painting, artist books and installations. His work touches on universal themes of migration, citizenship, belonging, cultural heritage and identity, timely issues indeed. Sebastian is well known for his use of non-traditional sculptural material with pop connotations using astroturf and neoprene, I hope I pronounced that correctly, to great effect to transform public spaces. He has held over 45 solo exhibitions and his work has been included in excess of 100 group exhibitions in Australia and internationally. And we are fortunate to have Sebastian back in Brisbane as he opens his latest exhibition, Greenback, at One Space Gallery in Highgate Hill. Brisbane's urban landscape is dotted with many of his public art pieces, including one of the largest single public art commissions to date for 33 Charlotte Street, all leading to his international reputation as a successful public artist. It is also a pleasure to welcome here tonight inimitable arts writer Louise Martin-Chew, who will shortly join Sebastian in conversation. Ms. Martin-Chew is a freelance arts writer who has contributed to magazines, newspapers and catalogues for over 30 years. If you are joining the conversation on social media tonight, don't forget to use the hashtag SLQPortrait. And as you checked in, you would have received one of these postcards. I urge you to go online to discover more wonderful stories in the James C Sourris AM collection. There are about 25 artists in total so far, and they're on the back of that card. Thank you, and please enjoy the screening and tonight's Q&A.
I've come to terms with a lot of stuff that I would never have come to terms with about my family and my background. Those issues that I had experienced being Italian-Australian. In my early part of my career, I totally didn't at all engage with my family background. So for me to go back and look at that was a pretty major part of my life, to reflect on it. When I did that first show, which was Panna, which means bread and sugar, that was a major turning point for my work. Although I'd started to look at things, in relation to my Italian background earlier than that, but was tentative, very tentative. And then I became braver about it. I actually began my career as a painter, and I was painting images which were pretty loaded. I mean, they were extremely loaded, but when I put them out into the public realm, people didn't see it. They just saw them as abstract painting. And so nobody really understood what I was going on about. So I got quite concerned about it. And I thought, well, how am I going to get some of these ideas across? Because I felt really strongly about them. So that's how it began. I started using materials to convey some of the issues that I was looking at in my work. So sugar, of course, because I lived in North Queensland, it was completely embedded in our lives, completely, even to my mother's despair of, having clothes on the clothesline and all the ash floating down and making all the clothes black. And olive oil, we live with it, it was part of our lives forever. Very important. My mother would not use anything but olive oil. Then AstroTurf was very much about my grandparents. They left Italy and were seeking greener fields, brighter futures for themselves and for their children. So slowly I built a repertoire of different materials that for me meant something. The history of the material and the dialogue of the material was the important part of making the work. Lots of the materials that I was investigating in the objects that I was making or installations that I was doing then became part of the artist's books. One of the first ones I made that was all loaded with images, and images made out of materials like snake skins and muslin, and images that I'd found in a newspaper. It had sulphur in it, it had ash in it. And so the next book that I made, which was the carpet underlay books, and they were huge, and the word silenzio was used, which was silence in Italian. I was so tentative, even at that stage, about making artworks relating to my Italian background. So, it was one of the first stages of me actually starting to use the language. The language thing is really important because my grandparents couldn't speak English. So for me, I could speak their language, which was Sicilian actually, not Italian, and I could speak English. So I was, bilingual, which was fantastic. And what was happening with me as I grew older and my grandparents passed was this whole idea of language and the fact that I was losing the language of my grandparents. And that was a major realisation for me. It was so important to kind of investigate, to connect it again to my Italian background. I really felt that it was really important to do that. Another way of working that I hadn't done before was object making. The Flockus came out of that. It moved me from being really interested in installation and into object making, and profoundly focused on objects. I do installation and I really like installation, but I didn't realise I liked the object as much as I do. A lot of the work that I did for Flockus were very much this aspect of looking at interconnections, and I guess interconnections between humans and nature. And a lot of the forms have come out of that, and I've been really interested in that organic connection. I collect these things from the garden or on walks that I do, and pick up seed pods, and they're the basis for the work that I make. But the forms themselves would be maybe abstracted. Oftentimes I'll look at a form and how it relates to the human body or how it relates to an animal. Oftentimes I combine these forms together in one shape to make the form itself. So this interconnection was what I was really trying to investigate in those works. It's interesting looking back at the work and think about the things that I've done and achieved and the processes that I've gone through to get to the stages that I've gotten to. The story that I've written has been so important for me that I've come to terms with a lot of stuff about my background. And I guess for me, And I often say this to my students that, you know, what's important to you as a person? What is it about you that makes you you? And that makes me me.
Thank you. And Sebastian, would you like to join me up here? Our mics have magically started to work. I don't know how that is, but thank you, Tony. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight with you all to talk to Sebastian about his work, and I'm sure you'd all agree that 6 minutes of video is kind of an exhilarating rush through your life and work and the things that have been important to you, the materiality, your family. Firstly, let's just talk about the fact that at the door here is one of Sebastian's welcome mats. I don't know if you've probably walked on it and not even realised, but it has the word porta on it. And these works, Sebastian made 11?
2011. Yeah.
In 2011 he made a series of these welcome mats which have never been seen before in Australia. No. So it's a really interesting idea that we should walk in and wipe our feet on your work, Sebastian. So I wondered if you might talk to us about what you're intending.
Sure. Those works were very much about a reflection on immigrants coming into a country and their experience of being in the country and what it was really like. And I guess I was thinking a lot about that in relation to my grandparents. Those works are really for my grandparents, but it was very much about what it was like for them to have come into a country that they didn't understand. And some of the words that I thought about when I was considering these works, there were many words that I selected, and I had to narrow it down to 9 because I decided I was going to do 9 works. And it really is a collection of words that in some way describes the experience of an immigrant coming into a country for the first time. And oftentimes I was thinking about particularly non-English speaking background people and what it must be like for them to come into a country and not being able to speak the language. So I was thinking of how they might feel and what their response might be when they arrive. And the whole thing of a mat is that you kind of wipe your feet before you come into a country. And in a way, I was thinking a lot about it and thinking that that's what we ask our immigrants. You know, we only want these good bits, we don't want the bad bits. You leave those outside. When you come here, we only want these, the nice bits, the bits that we like about you. And I think that's how I felt about my grandparents coming over and what it was like for them. And some of the words like porta is door, and menzano means in between, and altro means other, lontano means long, a long way away, and vero means true, truth. What truth is there? And then there were English words of exotic, and there were times when I felt very unwanted in Australia, and I was born here, and there were times when I felt very much like the exotic. We think you're great because you're Italian. But we were embraced. I was embraced when I was in my 30s, which took a long time. But it was they were the words that I was thinking about when I was making that was the importance of this work. And it's a really important work for me, even though they're welcome mats, and it's that whole idea of welcoming you into the country, but only welcoming in certain bits.
In some ways, they feel quite prescient to see them now in 2019. After a period where, global transience has been so much more emphasised and we're so much more aware of it, there's so much more of it going on. So in a way, they speak to us even more strongly now than they did when you made them.
I guess so. And I feel very much a part of this because I've now immigrated to the States, and I feel very aware of what perhaps some of the issues that my grandparents faced, but not to the same extent. I mean, I've gone into a country that I really know. I've been to the States many times with my partner, and I've met his family, and we're very close. I speak the same language. I don't have to negotiate a language issue. I do have to negotiate a monetary situation, but as far as the language, it's very simple. Although some people would say that there are some differences in language. And my partner will probably tell you that.
But let's go back first and talk about a little bit more about the influence of your family. So if we could play that clip, Tony, please.
Major. That's a tough one. My family were really, very important, as they are in everybody's life.
Yeah.
But for me, I guess, it was a tough one. I grew up in North Queensland, and it was bliss. I mean, paradise, as I say. When I go back there, it's an amazing place, and I was there with like-minded people. So we had friends that were Italian, and they were Spanish, and they were Maltese, and Chinese, and lots of different cultures were all in that same community.
Yeah.
It was a small community, and my grandparents lived beside us, my aunt lived beside us, and we lived not far away, and my other aunt and uncle lived not far away as well. So it was a very close-knit family group.
So you made Panna Ezukuro, which was the very beautiful work with the sugar and the olive oil, in 1998 when you were 43. You began working with your family heritage a little bit earlier, in your 30s. And I feel like it's when you really hit your straps as an artist, when the work became fueled by that personal material.
I think certainly it was very much about who I was. I was trying to discover who I was. I mean, I'd been beaten out of me when I came to Brisbane, certainly that, you're Italian, we just don't want you here. But once I hit, my 40s, it was a different ball game. Everything changed for me and for Italians in Australia. And it made a big difference to who I was, I think. And I felt very much more confident about who I was. Isn't it? It's sad, isn't it?
It is sad.
That I had to wait that long to feel really comfortable being an Australian Italian.
And, in a way, perhaps there's an almost inevitable maturing process as well as the external forces
absolutely, sure.
Going on there. You've done a lot of teaching in Brisbane, and in the video you say you recommend to students that they really examine their own lives and interests to give their work power. And it sounds like an obvious thing in a way, but I know many art historians believe that the art and the life, certainly in terms of critical reception, should be regarded separately. You say all artists should use their own voice, should have their own voice. And at the end of that 6-minute clip, you say what gave your work power is what makes you you. So I just wondered if you'd talk about that as an artist, about how important it is to draw on your own.
I think for me it's critical, and I always advise my students to do the same, as I said in the interview, because it makes your work different to somebody else. I think that's the first thing. And then it's coming from the heart, so if it's coming from there, then it's real. And that's when I realised, that was a big step. Once I'd realised that, then I felt more empowered, and I think the work was much more, much stronger. It was much more considered. I thought about it a lot more. Not that I didn't before that, but it was a very different process of thinking. When I started to understand who I was, then it almost fell into place. Materials I was selecting were relevant to who I was, rather than being just materials, being seduced by a material like a snakeskin or sulfur. I'm a sculptor and I love these various materials, but now I think very carefully before I pick a material to use. And I think that's all part of it. That's all part of who I am and what I'm about. So yes, it was amazing, that revelation to myself.
And those sorts of decisions they really give your work such a level of conceptual depth as well. They're
absolutely.
so deeply thought. Everything you've done, really.
I know. I know people sometimes look at my work and think it's just abstract, but for me, it's not abstract at all. In some ways, it's quite literal, and I think, oh my goodness, I just see all this stuff, and then there are people who come in and understand it immediately. They don't need any explanation because they understand the work, and it can be anyone, just anyone off the street who comes in. can understand the work, whereas I've had art historians who look at my work and don't understand it. So that was interesting for me to come to terms with that, because it's to do with life experiences, and not all work will be read by everyone in the same way, and that's the power of art. That's the marvellous thing about art, is that everyone will read it differently. Everyone has a different life experience, and when you look at a piece of art, you bring with that, to that artwork, your experience and your understanding of that work, which is amazing and rich, rather than being the opposite. Oh, well, you know, they didn't understand the work, well, therefore it's not good work. That's not true. I think that the fact is that you're bringing something to the work as well, that it makes it a richer experience for the individual looking at the work themselves.
For me, as a non-artist, you know, I remember actually seeing Panna all those decades ago, actually, and there was a sense with the smell and the tactility of the work that you were being led into this sort of darkened and quite special space. You were taking us into your space, and you know, that's why I think I've never forgotten that experience. I think artists have a lot of generosity in what they share with their work, and they put it all out there for the rest of us to, you know, wander around and look at.
And I think that's the great thing about art, is that it opens it up to other people. Art is about communicating. You know, it's not about making the work and hiding it in a box or in a room that nobody's going to see. Art is very much about communicating to other people. And when people can communicate with the work in their own way, then it's powerful. It's powerful for them. And I think as an artist, that's what I really would like to try and do, is to communicate. That's what I aim to do, is to communicate to people some of the issues that I've faced and they may be facing, but in a different way.
So let's just go back to the video and have a look at some of those issues you faced as a child, moving from, you know, the bosom of your family to Brisbane, and quite a different environment. So if we could have the next clip, please, Tony.
We had to move to Brisbane in the 60s, late 60s, and that was a major change in my life. And, you know, for the better, mostly. Yeah. But with that came a change of schools. I changed schools when I was in grade 8. So at that time, coming to Brisbane and being part of a boys' school was traumatic, in the sense that it was an Anglo-Saxon school. Very few people from other cultures went to that school. And so it was a very awkward time for me, and very much where I didn't want to know about my family. So, or as in family background and so on, because I was, you know, there's quite a bit of racism that was occurring in the school, and in fact in Brisbane as well. Yep. So during that time I didn't want to know about it. So in my early part of my career, I totally didn't at all engage with my family background. But from about my 30s, my mid-30s, I started to understand what it was like to be Italian again, or Sicilian, to be honest. Not Italian, but Sicilian. And you know, my partner often says, well, you know, what's the difference? It's a huge difference. Sicilian is Italian, but it's also Sicilian, and it's got its own significance. So for me to go back and look at that was a pretty major part of my life, to reflect on it.
So it's tough, you know, that what you're expressing there, that childhood isolation. And I feel like, you know, the work's often, like in the 1950s, multicultural difference was much less common than in the Australia of today. And, you know, as a person, you've got so many levels of difference in a way from the norm. You know, you had that experience of Italian, Sicilian parents, different language, you know, gay and celiac as well. And I guess I feel like you've travelled this huge journey and here you are, a very well-rounded individual that we see in the video.
I hope so.
So how do you manage that, Sebastian?
I just think it's about acceptance, certainly. I tried to be Australian, and I don't look Australian. Do I look Australian? You know, I tried to think that I looked white. I mean, how could I ever think that? But I did. And I was short, I was dark, and I was gay. I mean, what else is left? I mean, I had all of those various issues. I think that it's acceptance and it's maturity and it's coming to terms with a lot of that stuff. And art has really helped me to do that. I mean, it's art that's really paved the way for me. And I've been able to investigate a lot of these issues in my work through my work. And that's really helped. But I've also had a very understanding family. I've had a wonderful family. I have a wonderful family. I still have a wonderful family, both here in Australia and also in America. And very caring and very loving, and I think that helps as well.
And you talk about in the video the power of kind of writing your own story with the book you brought out in 2009, The
Yes.
Footnotes to a Virtuous Tale. So how powerful was that for you as an artist to change media and write it?
It was tough. Initially, it was very tough, but it was something that has been seminal to my work. I mean, it was a way of understanding it all. You know, I wrote this story and I just sat down and I just wrote it and then I said to I think I gave it to my brother or my sister and I asked them to read it, but I don't know if they ever did read it. But I tried to read some of it to my dad and he was, I think that was really good for him to have listened to some of that because he couldn't read at the time. But that was a very, very significant time for me to write that. And it was really serendipitous because the gallery in Cairns said, look, you know, would you do this show and we'd like you to do it about your family and about the Italians in the cane fields. And I said, sure. And then I realised what I was doing and I had to then make a show based around it. But it was very powerful doing that and in some ways understanding that whole scenario of where it come from. It was basically putting down in writing what I was thinking in my head and what I was making in my work.
And in a way, writing can sometimes make something coherent, which is not coherent until you write it down.
I think so. I think art deals with it in a different way. It's such a visual language, which is exactly what it is, and it's great. But writing, it's much more cerebral, and I guess that's pretty important as well. Yeah, I think it was very important.
So now you're having the experience as an immigrant yourself, having relocated to the US. It's another experience of marginalisation.
Yes, it is.
So I just wondered if you could talk a bit about how that feels, you know, in the strange situation, because America is so familiar to us as Australians, but it's still different.
It is extreme. I mean, as I said, I've been going to America. Dennis and I have been together now for 12 years. And it's been a fantastic experience and a great journey. But going over, you know, and Dennis experienced this first, so you've got to understand, he's come here and lived in Australia for 6 years, and for him to do that, he was in turmoil for quite a long time. And it was interesting because I understood, but I didn't understand. My grandparents had come out and I'd seen them go through something like this, but I was very young, so I didn't really understand what was going on. And I didn't quite understand what Dennis was going on, even though I said to Dennis, look, I understand, it's okay, I understand. But he found it very traumatic, and you know, the plan was that I would go and live in the States at some stage to be with his family and to get to know his family. And so that's what we had planned, and it was time for me to go. And, you know, I spent a year in Australia before going, just getting things in order before I left. And whilst I was doing that, I mean, I was thinking about work, my artwork, and what I was going to do. And it was a long gestation period. I did not make any work for at least a year to 2 years after I'd left university, after teaching. I had made some small works whilst I was teaching, and then I stopped, and I needed a break. I just needed some time out. I needed some time to think about what was next, and that year really was very important for me. That idea that, you know, people think artists work all the time. They do in their head, not necessarily all the time making, but they often think about things in their head, and it takes time for that to come through. And I knew this was going to be a long time thing about the next body of work that I was going to make, and I gave myself the luxury of time. So I get to the United States and I expect it to be, difficult. And it was difficult. I was there on my own, but of course I had a partner. I spoke the language. I understood the culture, so I thought. I understood the language, so I thought. And I felt, I was in a family who really cared for me and we were close, very close to all the family. And that was good, but it was not the same. I mean, I'd left my family behind. That was really hard to do. My brother and my sisters were here, and that was hard to leave them. And being there made me understand that idea of breakage, of pulling away, of being alone, of being in another country. And I had been thinking about works, as I said to you, before I left Australia and what I was going to do, and I knew it was going to be something to do with something soft that I could put in a bag and bring back, because I wanted to have a show here. And my appreciation of textiles, I love textiles. I've worked with textiles quite a lot in my work, and you would have seen some of the textiles that I've been working on. And so I knew it was going to be soft, and then I started to think about, well, what do I want to say? What am I going to talk about? What the hell am I going to make? And it all fell into place. When I was there, I started transferring money from out of my bank account and putting it into another bank account. I actually could have a bank account, believe it or not, which was a big thing. To get a bank account was really difficult. It's not as easy as you think it is. So we eventually got one after 2 months, Dennis, of being there, and finally got one. And so then I had some sense of being connected. Believe it or not, that simple thing of being connected was really important. So I had a bank account. I took money out of my Australian account, lots of money, and ended up putting into an American account, which dwindled considerably. And I then had to try and live off that. And so I started to withdraw money, and I'd seen American dollars. I'd been to America, for 8 years. I'd seen it. I knew it well, but I didn't know it at all because I wasn't looking at it. And when I started to investigate the money and look at it closely, I realised the history of America is embedded in the notes. And of course, in Australia, it's the same thing. But over there, the buildings say so much about the culture. And so I started to understand a lot more about the American culture and how it was built up and the founding fathers and so on. And I started to realise that this was a really important series of images that I was working with, and how could I use these somehow in the work. And I was also in an area where quilting was pretty significant. I was very close to an Amish settlement up in Newcastle. And no? I'm being corrected, sir. Lancaster County, that's right. So we went up to Lancaster County where the Amish live, and they really do live in a different way, very different way. It was fascinating to see. And so there's that whole quilting history that is very much part of American culture, so I connected those two together. And I'm digressing, aren't I? So I was looking at that whole idea of where I belonged, and trying to work out where I belonged, I was trying to fit into this country that I was living in, particularly in the area that I was living in, which was this amazingly beautiful area of the East Coast of America. And somehow it had to come into the work that I was making. And the money, because Washington DC is not far away, and I'd been travelling to Washington DC quite a bit with Dennis, and had admired these amazing buildings, and then seeing them on the notes, and the difference between seeing them as drawings, these beautiful drawings. If you look at an American note, look at the backs, because those drawings are really beautiful. And so I started to investigate and really look closely at these amazing drawings, and the power of the money, and what it actually meant. And certainly I've gone into America at one of the most difficult times in American history, and so I was very conscious of that. And that's been very unsettling. Do I really want to be here, or should I be back home where it's a bit more stable? And then I read the news here, and I think, well, I don't know. I think I'm okay here. So that's the difference. I mean, I felt isolated. I felt, even though I had a family that cared for me there, I felt isolated. I felt as though I really didn't understand the language. I certainly didn't understand the culture. And yet there were snippets of it that I felt familiar and knew it very well. But in actual fact, sometimes I felt like an alien.
So it's a great insight for you, I guess, into your grandparents' journey to
Absolutely.
Australia. But also, you know, you used your art to make sense of the experience by finding a quilting tutor and investigating the history and engaging with the political situation as well.
Indeed, all in one hit. And I think that was the most amazing thing about doing those works, is that I actually did learn a lot about the culture, but also where I fitted, or where I think I fit. I mean, I don't know where I fit really, but at this stage, at this early stage. But it's an amazing country, and there is a lot of anxiety about America, I think, around the world, and that's to be understood. But when you're actually there and you understand, you meet some amazing people and you see some fantastic art, some of the best art I've seen. I mean, not that there isn't great art here, there's fantastic art in Australia, but just being exposed to art that I grew up with in books, I see it in galleries and I'm seeing it right in front of me, and it makes such a difference to seeing it in reality as opposed to seeing it in a book. So those things are fantastic. Going to the museums are wonderful.
Yes, yeah, it's all there. We might just talk a little bit about the power of language, which you touch on in the video. The State Library is celebrating the International Year of Indigenous Languages this year, guided by the action plan that goes with it. And it states languages, with their complex implications for identity, cultural diversity, spirituality, communication, social integration, education and development, are of crucial importance for people and the planet. People not only embed in languages their history, traditions, memory, traditional knowledge, unique modes of thinking, meaning and expression, but more importantly, they also construct their future through them. So we might just go to the clip where you talk about the language of your grandparents.
I guess, yes, the language thing is really important because my grandparents couldn't speak English. So there was this association. I'm not sure if I'm really answering your question, but I'll try and answer it this way. That, you know, for them, English was like this impossible thing. They couldn't understand it. They could slightly understand it, they couldn't grasp it. So for me, I could speak their language, which was Sicilian actually, not Italian, and I could speak English. So I was, bilingual, which was fantastic at an age of 4 or 5, or whenever you learn to speak. So, you know, the whole family could do that. So we were speaking both languages. Out of that context, you know, it was predominantly English that we were speaking, or Australian. So it was fairly important all the way through. And what was happening with me as I grew older and my grandparents passed was this whole idea of language and the fact that I was losing the language of my grandparents. And that was a major realisation for me. You know, once my grandparents died, then my mother died, and then my father died, so that language became very thin on the ground. And so I've been to Italy on a number of occasions, and, you know, I try to speak Sicilian to poor Italians who don't know Sicilian, and I'm communicating with these people, and some of them actually understand me. Most of them do.
Amazing. So I just wanted to ask you about that in terms of the realisation of the loss of language, and then the way you've obviously, you know, and continue to use materials to tell these important cultural stories, and how, you know, language and the materiality, you know, I'm looking at Porta at the door, how that really connects you back into your heritage and that language that, you know, is a bit tangential.
Well, language is, the thing about language for me is, as I said, I've lost a lot of the language that I had. And my sister, I'm very envious, of course, because she can speak pure Italian and I can't. And my brother has a good grasp of probably Sicilian and Italian, and I don't have anything at the moment because I'm losing it at a rate of knots. I go to Sicily and I fumble around with the language and I think, I'm an embarrassment. And, you know, they say to me, wow, you're speaking the language of 40 years ago, 50 years ago. It's amazing. Talk some more. I say, well, what do you want me to say? So there's this whole thing of language and loss and how sad it is for me. But in a way, how I connect with that is certainly materiality, and materials certainly speak very strongly for me of my Australian culture or from my Italian culture. And olive oil is a good example because I really wanted to use olive oil in my work, and I didn't know how I was going to do it. That was really a challenge, that one. And I thought, I have to use it because it was so important to us. Mum would use it every day. It was such a significant thing. And I didn't know how I was going to use it. And just the thought processes of using olive oil were numerous. And I tried so many different ways of trying to use it. I thought in a glass jar, and I thought, no, that's not, no, it's not going to work. And what if I did this and I did that? And then I finally decided that I was going to put it into a cone of sugar, and that the cone would really hold the sugar beautifully, which it did, and there's a little trick to it. So if you're wondering what that trick is, you can ask me after it. So the cone basically held the sugar, sugar cone held the oil, and then over a period of time, it drew the olive oil out and dispersed it around the outside edge. And it was this thing about assimilation, and I felt that certainly I had become assimilated within the culture, and I was very proud of that, but at the same time holding on to my background. So olive oil was a really important way of reconnecting to my culture, and still to this day I still use olive oil, and I often think of my mother and how often she used it. So that's one material that I've used. But I use metaphorical materials like AstroTurf. Now, why would I use AstroTurf? Everyone, what the hell do you use AstroTurf? Well, AstroTurf is really important because when I think about my grandparents coming to Australia, they left a very difficult life. They couldn't own land. They wanted to have their own land. They wanted to grow their own things. And so they eventually decided to move out, migrate here, which was very difficult. And they came with nothing, as most immigrants came in those days from overseas. And they started their life all over again. And so this whole idea of looking for greener fields or greener pastures was really important in the AstroTurf works. It was about that greenness. It was about that hope. It's about the dialogue. It's a metaphor for hope. It's a metaphor for... And the fact is that it's never going to die. So that hope is always there. And I often thought about my grandparents, and I often think, did they really fulfil all those dreams they had, all the dreams of coming to another country? Was it fulfilled when they came to Australia? And I think it was. I think they were really, really happy being here and really happy to see their children grow up and do well, and their grandchildren. So I think it was really a positive experience for them. And so...
Tim Morell wrote that your work was an exploration of the fundamental truths of life through the most basic of materials, and I think that's pretty nice pertinent. Which takes us to the big issues, and could we play the last clip, Tony, about artist books and what they mean to you, Sebastian?
Coming back to your question, my interest in artist books is very much because I came through that design process, and I was working with books all the time, and particularly books for artists and so on. And I really enjoyed the process of putting together a sequential series of images or notions, or the fact that a book holds knowledge. And all of the conceptual premise of a book was really interesting. And so when I started making my own books, of course, there was no text, there was no knowledge. They were one of the first ones I made that was all loaded with images, and images made out of materials like snake skins and muslin, and images that I'd found in a newspaper. It had sulphur in it, it had ash in it. Lots of the materials that I was investigating in the objects that I was making or installations that I was doing then became part of the artist's book. So basically, and the artist's books, they weren't in pages, they were just loose. So the idea was that it was an artist's book, but it wasn't an artist's book in the true sense. And so that playing and flirting with the idea of the book was really interesting.
So we are lucky enough to have an original Sebastian Di Mauro artist book here down at the front, which I urge you all to have a look at. It's a pretty incredible work. It's just uses a few
Slate tiles.
Yeah, slate tiles with some icons etched on them. And I think for you it takes us to really the big issues of your life. There's an existential message in this book.
There is. I had a very serious car accident when I was 21, and it really changed my perspective on life, and it was a very cathartic experience, but it was also a really positive experience. I mean, going through something like that, you would think it'd be really negative. It really wasn't for me at all. I learnt a lot about life and the value of life, and how much I needed to put it into perspective. And, you know, I tend to embellish and be concerned about silly things, and the real things in life are the important things, and it really taught me to reflect more deeply on the simple things. A fabulous sunset, or a breeze, or a flower, or a seed, or growth, or just simple things. Somebody that you love, and telling them that. It really made me aware very much about the basic things in life, which mean more than objects and things, I think.
We are kind of getting to the end of when I get to give the floor over to the audience. You get to ask the questions. Some of the things I haven't got to talk to you about, Sebastian, is the studio and public artwork, but we might canvass that in the questions. But I'm aware we're kind of blowing the schedule a little bit. It's your turn. Do we have any questions from the floor for Sebastian?
No questions. Is that good or bad?
Well, maybe, but while we're waiting for somebody to have an idea about that, you could just talk to us briefly about the relationship between the studio work and
the studio work and
the work for the public realm.
Public art has been an interesting investigation in making art. Why would anyone want to do public art? The reason is that public art gives you money to make things that you would never be able to afford to do. And I think that's one of the best things about it. The other thing is that for me, I don't know if I could have made public art unless I had made made work. And I mean, by work, I mean my practice. If I hadn't done my practice, then I couldn't actually, I don't think I could have made good public art. And it's a very, very challenging process, making public art, because, you know, at what point do you consider your audience, and at what point do you consider your client, as opposed to considering what you want to make? And that is often a challenge. Who am I making this work for? Am I making it for the audience, the client, or me? Do I get a say in any of this? And I guess that's been an important point when negotiating public art. I've been to many meetings where there've been, 14 people deciding on a work that you've just presented, and you walk out and you think, I didn't get that one. And then you go into another one, you feel really confident. There's probably 3 or 4 people there, and it's a really great idea. It doesn't get up. And I think that, I guess other people in the arts would feel similarly, an architect or a designer. I know as a designer I used to do the same thing, and we'd say to a client, but this is a fantastic idea. And they just couldn't buy it. They just said, oh no, so that was it. And public art is a little bit like that, but not as much as, I guess, as it was in the design industry. when I was working in the design industry. But it's very rewarding doing public art, but it's also important to do my own practice, because my own practice then informs my public art process. And sometimes it all comes together, and sometimes I've done so many concepts. I've got filing cabinets full of concepts that never got taken up. So it's a tough game, but it's a rewarding game.
Do we have any questions?
We did have some
there?
questions.
Oh, very
Sharon?
good.
I'm fascinated by the Chinese work.
Yes.
So, do you actually make these yourself, or
No.
so
No.
they're manufactured here under
No.
your...
In China, they're manufactured in China. I've been working with a fantastic company called Urban Art Projects to in fact fabricate a lot of my work. And they have an office in China, they have an office in the United States, they have an office in Melbourne, I think one in the Arab Emirates, I think. Sorry? The Brisbane base?
There.
They started in Brisbane, yes, of course,
yeah.
but they've got offices in various... Yeah. So I have done some public artwork in Australia with Urban Art Projects or UAP, and then I was asked if I'd like to do one in China, and they said, UAP said, look, we'll fabricate it over here, and so I said, yeah, that's great. And it was basically a work that I had made here, which I okayed with the client to remake over there, but was slightly different. And they fabricated in China, and it was, the work in China was superb. I mean, they work with fantastic artisans over there. And so I went over and visited and met with the fabricator, and then we discussed what was going to happen, and then it went from there. So I came back and negotiated the process through computers and phone calls. But they make all my have they made all my public artwork? Not all of it, but most of it.
Wonderful marble table.
That was different. That was made by Sam Rafter and Sons. Right. It was Rafter and Sons who carved the table for us. Sam and I worked on that together, and that was for the Italian community. And we were approached by this fantastic fellow to produce this work, and he wanted to put it in a public place. And the process of getting that work into a public place, let alone getting it fabricated, was enormous. We pretty well did that one as a sponsorship, which we're very proud to have done it, and to have been asked. But we really enjoyed the process. It was a very long process to get it from design through to fabrication, or design accepted within the community, the Italian community, and then within the council, and then from council, it was then approved, and we went to production, and Rafters built that one. So not all of the work is done by them, but Sam and I had a great time doing that. That was a really...
Nice to be brothers working on it.
It was great. And so that was a really nice experience. And working with Sam is great. He puts up with me.
Was there another question? Oh.
Turn this on now, I think. Is that working? Yeah.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
So fascinating. I was really so taken by that. You were saying the review of your works about profound truths, yet using simple materials. And I'm just wondering about material selection. And I'm looking at the public work, and then I'm looking at your amazing, innovative personal practice. What is your decision-making process, whether it's for public display or for your own personal gallery reflections? How do you decide on material? Does that come first, or does the idea come first, then you find a material that suits the idea?
That's a good question.
Or?
That's a good question. I would say it's both. I think it's often, for this current work that I've got on exhibition at One Space, it was the idea. The idea came first, and then I had to sort of think about what I was wanting to say specifically. And I used army blankets for that because I was very conscious of a lot of money being spent on military from the United States. So I wanted to reflect on that. So that was really a long process of thinking. But sometimes it's the material that talks to you. You know, I've been using blankets in my work for many years. I mean, I started using blankets in, I think, earlier than that, 1996 maybe. And it's this whole thing, the blankets have so much history and narrative embedded in them that I wanted to use that narrative with the work that I was making. And so in these works it was very important. And the fact that it was money and it was green, and the fact that it's the army or the military, that it was green, really sung. It just fitted into place, it just fell into place. So sometimes it's the material that is really seductive, and sometimes, and that's the problem, you know, you can get seduced by material and you think, I have to use this material, and it's like, well, what are you talking about, Sebastian? It's got no relevance to you whatsoever. Why are you wanting to use that? You know, so it's a to and fro scenario, and sometimes, you know, you think it's really important, and other times you don't, and you have to make those decisions as you go along. But it is very much about, generally it's an idea, sometimes it's the material itself.
Do we have time for one more question, Jacinta?
Hi, Sebastian. I just wanted to say how much some of what you were talking about of your experience spoke to me. Just having been in America for 3 months on a fellowship and having that little experience of living there and having had a health issue there, and suddenly felt it was all right money-wise, except it was strange waking up to a card from the hospital's financial counsellor.
Yeah.
But it was just weird, especially with no if Caroline hadn't have been there, I would have found it very, very lonely, because none of our friends actually visited, and
yes,
it was just different. And I still haven't got over seeing political ads advocating the death penalty during an election. That really shocked me. But
yeah, there's a lot of stuff over there.
But one of the things that what I wanted to say too is, as I think I'm a fifth generation Australian on both sides, so I grew up in a very Anglo house. But when you had the olive oil and sugar, when I was a kid in the 60s, I had croup, and I was given olive oil, a tablespoon of sugar soaked with olive oil.
Well, there you go. It's a medicinal. It's very medicinal.
It actually works. It cuts through the mucus. And, incredible. So it just really spoke to me, that artwork. Thanks.
Yes, I mean, I think that's the thing about olive oil. It's got so many great properties about it, and it's really only been discovered in Australia, I don't know, 15 years, I guess. But, you know, it was part of our lives, and it was amazing that we were very lucky to have that.
Well, thanks everyone so much for being here. If you would like to hear more from Sebastian, there is a repeat performance, but more specifically about Greenback, which is the work that's now on at One Space Gallery. There'll be another conversation there tomorrow at 4:15, followed by the opening of the exhibition if you'd like to come and hear more stories from Sebastian, who's a very entertaining speaker. Clearly we could go on for hours. Thanks too to John Stafford, who did the original very insightful interview. And I think now we have a raffle.
Okay.
You have your drawing. And the raffle, there's two. So there are 2 books to be won.
Okay.
I think your tickets are under your seat. That's you've got them, okay.
007, how about that? Who's got 007? It's E007. There you go, Fred. That's fantastic.
And there's one more.
You're not going to do one?
No, you are the special guest.
Okay, here we go. Oh, I've got 2, so I'll put that one back.
Very above board here.
E052. 052, there you go.
Congratulations.
Fantastic. How do I do that?
And just finally, I just wanted to mention that the next portrait of an artist is Gordon Hookey, and that'll be in July, same place.
Fantastic.
And so that one also will be really fantastic. And thank you all for being here.